Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Dr. Paula Alonso was born in Buenos Aires, where she did her undergraduate degree. She then got her PhD at Oxford University. She taught for a while in the UK and then moved back to Argentina, where she taught at the University of San Andres. She then came to the United States, where she started teaching at George Washington. She barely overlapped with Kirk Larson, who was in the history department, just a tad. Her and her husband and their daughter love to ski. They've been to Utah multiple times. Alta is their destination of choice. This time, however, they're unable to ski, so they are seeing some national parks after. Her husband's also here, and he will lecture in the econ department tomorrow on his work in Latin America. Dr. Alonso has published numerous books in English as well as in Spanish, including Between Revolution and the Ballot Box, which she published with Cambridge University Press. We could go on, but we'll stop there so she can have time for her presentation. So let's give Dr. Alonso a hand.
Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here today and get to know more about you and Utah and Salt Lake City and other places that I didn't have a chance to see when I used to just fly from Washington and go straight to Alta for a few days of skiing. So thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. All right, so this is very much still work in progress. So I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments at the end. And my work centers now on the discussions of democracy and some of their implications for the political practices of mid-19th century Latin America. I focus on 3 urban centers today, which are Lima, Santiago de Chile, and Buenos Aires. And for many, the idea of thinking or researching about democracy in mid-19th century Latin America, it's a bit intriguing, at the least, because this has been a period that it has rarely been associated with democracy. These are years, the 1830s to the 1860s, in which generally it has been, these countries have been run by authoritarian rulers or caudillos that Jeff Shanway knows very well about, and he's written extensively on, or years of chronic political instability. So rarely these practices have been linked to democracy. Let me just say then that even though this is still a new area of research, my work builds on previous important work. One set of works derived from what we call the history of concepts, that for the Iberian world during the age of revolutions, that is the 1770s to the 1870s, has been led by Javier Fernández Sebastián. And the volume of democracy, which is number 2 here, offers a survey of how this ambitious term actually was unevenly invoked in Latin America during this time. And conceptual history is very important in bringing awareness about anachronism or teleological interpretations. But conceptual history sometimes is less sensitive to the usage of terms for political practices or for the shaping of institutions. So another set of work that has been very influential and I built my work on, and actually I've been part of this tradition, is what we call the new political history. And of course, it's not new anymore. It's more than 30 years plus and ongoing. But this set of works have really transformed our understanding of 19th century Latin American politics. And most recently, in 2018, Hilda Sabato wrote a synthesis of all these extensive works on Latin America in this book, Republics of the New World. These works, what they do is they underlined how the new Spanish American republics were characterized by widespread male suffrage, by political practices that involved large sections of the population, and by public opinion manifested through the press and civic associations. And however, even though these set of works have really illuminated this period and has really, as I said, changed our ideas about Latin American politics significantly, they have not really associated this phenomena with democracy. And in fact, myself, who I wrote extensively on the politics of Argentina at the time, at the moment, I really did not link it to democracy neither. So closer to my current research is the work that has been undertaken by Joanna Innes and Mark Philp in a series of what is now coming into a collection of books titled Reimagining Democracy. And the first book was actually focused on United States, France, Britain, and Ireland. The second book on the Mediterranean countries. And the third book is actually going to come out in June, and it focuses on Latin America and the Caribbean with an added editor of Eduardo Posada Carbó. I actually has been part of this third book. I wrote jointly with a co-author the chapter 8 that focuses on political practices and the use of democracy in them. So today's presentation builds on that. As I said, it mostly concentrates on the period between 1830 and 1860s. And in comparison to these selected cities of Lima, Santiago, and Buenos Aires, what I try to highlight is how democracy did not have a stable meaning during these years, that it was increasingly invoked to legitimize or undermine a variety of arguments and practices across the political spectrum. What I aim to show is how, particularly around the 1850s, the term was deployed to define social, ethnic, and social contours of the formal body polity, given that democracy, while increasingly used with positive connotations, something that I underlined in that chapter 8 that I mentioned, this time I focus in on the fact that it rarely lost its association with tumult, disorder, and even fear. However, as we shall see, however, the targets of those fears and the solutions adopted to address them vary significantly in these selected cities. And finally, what I also like to underline is how the term was constantly redefined and increasingly used but to understand their effects, we need to place them in context. We cannot just think about this for the entire region of Latin America. Okay, so in this study, democracy is analyzed as a shifting and contested term and a phenomena of changing political practices. Therefore, what I distance myself from is from studies that define democracy as a prescriptive or normative term with a set of corresponding variables. And this is a way in which generally the social sciences have been undertaking the study of democracy. But also it has been the case of a few studies on democracy in the 19th century, like those of James Sanders or Carlos Foment. So here, in contrast to those studies, what I do is I don't try to assess democracy in the region or try to search in the past for democratic roots. What I argue is that democracy became a term employed with different meanings by different political actors, used to defend different visions of Republican building. Okay, maybe I should put my glasses on. Okay, so these mid-centuries disputes of struggles over how to institutionalize the principle of people's sovereignty had emerged at the time of independence. The wars and the Cadiz Constitution of 1812 resulted in ample political mobilization and an egalitarian language in societies with sharp social, racial, and ethnic hierarchies. The Cadiz Constitution recognized as citizens all free men, excluding domestic servants, the bankrupt, and the unemployed, but it also included Native Americans, but excluded Afro-descendants, the castas. This exclusion was resisted by the Spanish Americans. In that resistance, they fostered a language of equality. And while this constitution initially only applied to the regions that remained loyal to the metropolis, the rebel areas also follow as civil arguments, pressure to gain recruits for the war. So therefore, in Spanish America, ample political participation and a rhetoric of equality, including racial equality, had been points of departure in the Republican building. In the following decades, citizenship continued to have an expansive meaning. Bless you. Reference to the people's social class, race, or color were generally excluded from formal documents such as national constitutions or electoral regulations, although in practice, discrimination and exclusion continued through different means. But the studies of the new political history I have shown is that in most cases, elections formally incorporated large sectors of the middle and lower classes, including Native Americans, mestizos, and free blacks, and that the elections were competitive and meaningful. That is, those who wanted to legitimize their rule had to go through the electoral process. So what roles, then, did invocations of democracy play by the mid-19th century in this context? Who employed the term in public debate? With what meaning and for what purposes? Responses to these questions varied, as we shall see. These three selected cities had different post-colonial experiences, different demographics, and different political cultures. I should note that in my research, I don't reduce democracy to elections, but for today's presentation, I'm also going to focus mostly on how it was invoked during the electoral processes. And also, I should say that, pressed for time, I'm not going to pay attention to ideological influences on how democracy was understood. Just let me say that given the context and the nature of the population at the time, many remain suspicious that experiences like the United States, read through Alexis de Tocqueville, could be achieved in Latin America. Doctrinaire ideas, those of François Guizot or Adolphe Thiers, involved the belief that democracy should mean the rule of reason, remain popular in Latin America even after 1848. Okay, this was very clear in the case of Buenos Aires in the 1830s and 1840s. So we are going to be referring first to Buenos Aires. The city was the capital of a province ruled by Juan Manuel de Rosas, who increasingly exercised control over 14 provinces that, having rejecting two constitutional proposals, ultimately functioned as a loose confederation of sovereign entities known as the River Plate. Rosas legitimized his rule by regularly calling for elections under 1821 electoral law, which, unusually for the time, had adopted direct vote for all free men over 20 years of age without further requirements. This was probably one of the earliest cases of male universal suffrage. The exceptionally inclusive nature of the franchise was not seen at the time as radical or democratic. It was rather the result of legislators' inability to find any clear fixed rule for exclusion in a society perceived as lacking deep inequalities or rigid social hierarchies. Indeed, the law had been part of a series of reforms undertaken in the 1820s to modernize the institutions with the aim of pacifying and educating a society that had been at war for many years. From above, they tried to build a society by stimulating the publication of newspapers, guaranteeing the freedom of the press, and promoting association and cultural life. Rosas' authoritarian and repressive rule, however, put an end to all these efforts. He kept, however, the electoral law, and he also built a popular base through propaganda campaigns, carefully cultivating the support of the popular sectors. In the city of Buenos Aires, that also including fostering the support of the black population, which, unlike Santiago and Lima, it was organized at the time in associations or nations, and it was underrepresented about 23% of the entire population of the city of Buenos Aires. And more than half of those could actually vote, so they were important electoral base to bring up. Rosas did not use the term democracy when cultivating his popular base, but his opponents, most of them forced into exile, increasingly resorted to the language of democracy in their printed attacks against Rosas. And here you have examples of how he cultivated those nations of the black population, which actually these pictures are also in Jeff Shamry's book. And here you also have images of some of the lithographies printed by the opposition, which they used one of the first times at the time that it was used, these drawings, because they also wanted to attract the attention of the popular sectors. So those in exile increasingly resorted to the language of democracy in their printed attacks against Rosas, and they blamed the 1821 law of universal suffrage for the rise of Rosas, arguing that it had been based on an erroneous idea of democracy and that his rule was a prime example of introducing democracy in societies not ready for it. Let me go back to the maps. Okay. So Santiago was the capital of Chile, the country that most rapidly achieved stability under a conservative constitution in 1833 and by the top-down rule of a conservative party. Democracy became more frequently used in the 1830s and 1840s, but more commonly, both liberals and conservatives referred to democracy as equality under the law and remained fearful of the potential excesses of the democratic spirit. Here, the main source of dispute between both parties was in the search of the support of the artisan groups, which, unlike in the case of Buenos Aires, where the artisan guilds had been disbanded after independence, here in Santiago, these guilds remained active, and more significantly, they had an important role to play at election times. So by 1850, to give an idea of how relevant they were, in Santiago, the artisan population was about 20% of the adult population of the city. But it was actually the connection between the artisans and the civil guards what made them very relevant at election times. The Constitution of 1833 established monetary or property thresholds for voting, but excluded the members of the guards from these requirements. And at the same time, the conservative governments had really expanded the numbers of the guards in the 1830s and 1840s. In Santiago, many artisans were also members of the guards, which represented half of the electorate of the city of Santiago. Under the supervision of the commanders, the guards became an important source of electoral support for the government, something that the liberal opposition constantly complained about. At election times, both liberals and conservatives increasingly used the language of democracy to attract support of the artisans. Conservatives claimed to be the real Democrats, as artisans benefited from the order and material progress the government had secured. Liberal claims to be the true Democrats, defenders of the artisans' political rights to free elections, currently suppressed by the commanders and the government. In neither the liberal or conservative campaigns, however, did democracy mean or suggested a change in the social basis of political power. For both liberals and conservatives, democracy meant strictly equality under the law. The post-colonial experiences of Peru was actually very different from those of the River Plate and Chile. Following independence, the country failed to achieve instability until the late 1840s, and politics remained dominated by military leaders, or called caudillos, in a successive string of revolts, elections, and constitutions. Invocations of democracy rose to the fore in Lima in the 1840s, when the country experienced some political stability and control and economic growth. However, the term remained not included in partisan disputes until we reached the presidential elections of 1850. And in fact, the 1850s that we're going to see, so we see the term really having a tremendous presence of partisan disputes in the three cases. In the case of Peru, here the extreme conservatives resorted to the concept of capacity to support in Congress a democracy where the illiterate will be excluded from voting, a measure that will strip most Indians, representing 60% of Peru's population, of which 80% were illiterate. And they also will exclude mestizos and the plebe or the lower classes from the right to vote. While the conservatives want to introduce these restrictions, liberals, on the other hand, supported universal suffrage as a form of civic pedagogy needed to achieve democracy, and also promoted associations, political clubs, the printed press, as hallmarks of vigorous civil society. In either case, the campaign alluded to social concerns. But while the liberals lost the presidential election in 1850, they had a chance to implement their program after a revolt in 1855 ousted the president. And during the revolt, all contending factions entered into negotiations with and made concessions to different sectors of society. And in this process, one of these concessions was the end of slavery in Peru, by which 17,000 enslaved people were free. Once the liberals gained power after the revolt, they had the opportunity to put into practice their ideas of representative democracy, consisting of a large electoral base where the most capable will be ruling. To achieve these goals, the liberals introduced universal and direct suffrage to all males over 21 years of age for national elections in the most expansive electoral law in Peru's history. And they also promoted a series of publications targeting the popular sectors. The law was implemented in 1855 to elect a constitutional convention, the first election ever after the abolition of slavery. And once the election was over, a public campaign was mounted by the conservatives, targeting the black population and the mestizo populations, holding them responsible for alleged rising crime in Lima, as well as increased violence and corruption on election day. While the electoral legislation in Peru never made explicit reference to blacks, race, or color, the rhetoric against the black population was used to demand raising the requirements for voting. And here you will see some pictures of Manuel Fuentes, who was an important journalist at the time, an intellectual, who, I quote him, he said, public citizens are capable of discrediting all democratic institutions and of degrading them to the point that whites renounce to their citizenship. So here you see him sort of a picture of popular politics, sort of pressuring the government, and here he's mocking the electoral process by saying that, you know, black population and the lower classes were now dominating that moment. The new drafted constitution of 1856, which for the first time defined Peru as democratic, introduced some requirements for voters. It was literacy or being the head of a workshop or owning property or having retired following service in the armed forces. The Constitution did not make any significant clauses regarding indigenous people. Many of them, as property owners, were included as citizens, even if they were illiterate. But it had, however, an important effect on the illiterate population, mostly of blacks and mestizos in the city, who were less likely to have property or be workshop heads, and therefore they could not fill the voting requirements. The language of democracy was not abandoned after the liberals' defeat. However, all groups began to use it to impose a particular meaning of the concept. Liberals continued to defend the principles of the 1856 Constitution and defending universal suffrage, while conservatives defined that Constitution and universal suffrage as an act of demagoguery and an example of primitive democracy that had to be overturned. In Chile, the events surrounding the discussions of democracy became more dramatic at the time of the presidential election of 1851. It took place in a comparatively more radical context than in Peru and actually ended in civil war. The presidential campaign displayed a brand of Chilean liberalism with a more egalitarian ethos in which the concept of democracy was deployed beyond the traditional references to equality under the law and civic freedoms. A group of young intellectuals led by Francisco Bilbao organized a series of artisan civic associations with the purpose of spreading the idea of education. It's good to be green, but then it gets confusing when you have to go through these pages. Okay. The most famous of these civic associations was the Society of Equality. Once these groups became embroiled in the presidential elections of 1851, they also deployed a concept of democracy that demanded popular political participation in the government and social equality. In a series of publications, they demanded universal suffrage to secure the practice of democracy, as well as a more democratic distribution of wealth. After some of these leaders of this group, considered radical for the time, were repressed by the police, they launched a revolt in Chile in 1851, which, after being suppressed, most of the leaders, including Bilbao, were forced into exile. Events took a different turn in Buenos Aires. After Rosas was removed from power in 1852, and after a series of more military battles, Argentina finally became a republic in 1861 under the leadership of the province of Buenos Aires. After the demise of Rosas, Buenos Aires witnessed a rebirth of its public and political life. Freedom of the press was restored, newspapers proliferated, and new associations and political clubs emerged. These events demanded the construction of new narratives that would move away Buenos Aires from past failing leaderships, misguided ideas of democracy, and tyrants supported by large sectors of the population. In the new narrative that is going to be constructed, the term democracy, now redefined, gradually acquired a new and central place in the public sphere. After several rhetorical twists, a new story for the province and eventually for the country emerged. Those who had opposed Rosas, as well as those who had supported it, they were all declared victims of the regime, and therefore they could be united as victims. Democracy became a central term denoting both a form of government and social equality. The 1821 electoral law of universal suffrage, which before was accused of empowering a tyrant, now was celebrated as a testimony of the original and profound democratic roots of Buenos Aires. It was argued also that Buenos Aires' renowned social equality positively differentiated her from other Latin American countries. It was a narrative that also carried with it a promise not only of social, but also of racial egalitarianism. The first publication produced by the Black community, printed in 1858, declared that their aim was to contribute to the country's democracy. However, it was not well received. The paper was accused of promoting divisions where none were said to exist, and for undermining the legal and social equality that was set to differentiate Argentina from other countries. And unlike the cases of Peru and Chile, in Argentina, the term democracy as universal suffrage, as social equality, and as racial homogeneity became essentials to the country's foundational fiction. To conclude, so once the wars of independence gave way to state-building processes, democracy gradually began to be associated in a varied ways and meanings with republican and representative systems, as opposed to the past, where it was just generally used as a term of direct democracy. In the 1830s and 1840s, while increasingly invoked by liberals and conservatives, the term remained ill-defined. It was not linked to a particular form of government or to the electoral systems, and did not lose its dreaded association with tumult and a disorderly conduct by the popular sectors. The Argentine exile community, as we saw, used the term against Rosas and caudillo rule. In debates in Santiago, democracy was publicly associated with different understandings of good government, and in Lima, while present in the public sphere, was not connected to partisan disputes until the 1850s. With the rise of unpopularity of the term, issues of class, race, and ethnicity played different roles. In Chile, the use of a more egalitarian definition as a universal male suffrage and a distribution of wealth was soon repressed. In Lima, a brief experimentation with universal male suffrage after abolition was soon replaced with further restrictions to undermine the Black, mestizo, and illiterate indigenous populations. In Buenos Aires, by contrast, democracy defined as universal suffrage and social and racial egalitarianism was used to unite all political rivals and as the foundational fiction of the country. It should not come as a surprise, then, that each country will soon follow different paths in relation to their franchise, all made in the name of democracy. In Peru, the restrictions adopted in the 1860s paved the way to more drastic restrictions when in 1896, a change in the constitution introduced literacy as the sole requirement for voting. That meant that in practice, it was an ethnic disqualification because it excluded the vast majority of the indigenous population from the polls who until then had enjoyed voting rights. And this will continue until the end of the 20th century. In Chile, issues of class predominated in a society perceived as having profound social divisions. The country followed a more gradualist expansion of the franchise, starting in 1874 with an electoral reform that doubled the number of the electorate, although the numbers of voters remained small, about 7% of the total population or 30% of the adult males. Argentina continued to cement the idea of a society with no divisions of race, class, or ethnicity, and it never changed the principle of universal male suffrage. Indeed, the province of Buenos Aires continued to experiment in forms that more fully could activate the principles of people's sovereignty, becoming one of the first cases in world history whose constitution adopted the principle of proportional representation in 1876. So I will end here. I just want to say that I also have a section at the end where I talk about how none of these cases took place in isolation from each other, but there were conversations and exiles moving from one country to another, and they were actually learning and becoming sometimes cautious about what was happening in one country when they went back to their own countries and tried to think about how to move forward in Republican building. Thank you so much. So is there any other area that you would like me to expand? I would be happy to do so. I was trying to leave enough time for all of you to make comments and ask questions.
Okay. I wanted to ask, and maybe this is something that you have in your larger paper, is like have we seen these definitions in like the current time today? Like how do we see the effects of those definitions? Oh, also I'm Kara, but yeah.
Thank you, Kara. I think in current times you can still see some of these tensions in which on one hand democracy is the fully participation of the people in the choosing of government. On the other hand, there are many fears about some popular sectors. And you can see that tension in Latin America very openly. So in the last 30, 40 years, when most Latin American countries move into democratic regimes, some of the thoughts about how to build more inclusive and democratic countries and governments were very much in the agenda in the region. And so we actually have produced tremendous innovation on how to do this. Like we have gender quotas. Half of the countries have gender quotas for representation in Congress and in many public positions. Also, some countries have explicit seats reserved for Afro-descendant populations or for indigenous groups. So you can see some of these issues still very, very much in the present, with both all these reforms being introduced and they're contesting ideas of what democracy is and should be, and how more fully use the term use the term of popular sovereignty to this full extent. So you can see in divisions in politics how these fears of democracy or these more inclusive notions of democracy still play a part. I think what is new for us is that we didn't know that this also played a part in the 19th century. We also thought that, okay, we have a very difficult 20th century history with so many military regimes and so forth that really make it difficult to go back into our own history and think about, where are these issues coming from? And so what I find in my research, and it's not just mine, is now it's becoming a trend to think about democracy. At the time, then we can see that I have a very long standing. Yeah.
Just building. Sorry, just building off of that. You know who I am, but
Yes.
I was just wondering, with your research, then, like, what do you see? Because you talked about how before people haven't really looked at democracy in Latin America in the 19th century. So, like, what can be added to the historiography by looking at democracy? Like, what's missing from the story right now that this focus on democracy can add?
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Yes, Jonathan was a student of mine in the George Washington University, and one of the best students we had, actually. So, very nice to see you here. So this is something that it could not have done. I mean, thinking about democracy in the 19th century is something that it could not have been done without all the previous work that it was done about democratic practice. And until very recently, I mean, I wrote, Jeff mentioned my first book, which is based on the history of our oldest national political party in Argentina. It's called the Radical Party, which it wasn't very radical, but that's the term that was adopted. And it was a party that it was founded in the 1890s. And we all assumed, and this is, I did my PhD in the late 80s, early 90s, and we all assumed that, and this is what the history had told us, that the party had founded in the 1890s, had not participated in the elections until 1912, until an important electoral reform. And then I went to the archives and actually saw that they did participate. And actually they did quite well. And they were competitive. And, and then I began to look at the support they had. And that happened, can be replicated about our ignorance of the 19th century in most Latin American countries. We really didn't know very much about that because we always assumed, elections, newspapers, public opinion. This is for the 20th century. We were not in the 21st century yet, but it was for the 20th century. And so without all the work done in which we began to learn about, electoral processes that started very early, about the nature, about the inclusive nature of it, how different it was, these were also republics that were part of the Republican building movement of the 19th century, but it had its peculiarities. So until all that work was done first, we couldn't really begin to think about democracy because there was a vacuum in the historiography to be able to link that. And that's in a way why, Hilda Sabato and myself and many others, did all that work without really thinking about democracy. When I began thinking about it, I said, did I miss something? So I went back to my notes from my PhD, 30 years ago and said, did I miss something? I know. And there are many reasons why I didn't see it. I can talk about that if you like. So what this adds is another dimension, a dimension that it wasn't there, that it makes us think what it meant at the time, why the term was used, what are the implications of it, why people will argue that stripping out of a large section of the population from the right to vote was still democratic, and they would still call this democracy. So what this is giving us, and this is just new research in the going. This is just happening. The people who got together to write this third volume on reimagining democracy, we were just thinking about this for the first time in those terms. And so it's beginning to add a new dimension to the story, which again, if we think about what is the uses of history, well, it helps us to understand the present too, given Kara's previous question. Yes. Yes.
Hi, my name is Savannah Lee. I'm a political science major. So today in your lecture, you talked about universal male suffrage, and I'm wondering, in your research, what was the role of women? Were they involved in conversations? Were they involved in any sort of these political processes?
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Savannah, for that question. Great question. Yes, they were involved. So formally, they were excluded. In some areas of Peru, I saw that sometimes actually they were not explicitly excluded, and some voted. In some countries like Chile, they were actually implicitly excluded until in the 1870s. They tried to vote, and they said, no, we are really going to explicitly exclude it now. And so, however, that is the formality of the electoral process. Informally, they were participating very actively in what we can call the public sphere, if you like. So they will participate in campaigning, they will run salons, they will write, they will be journalists. Some women fought in the war, so they were active in the public sphere. It's just when we think about rights as citizens, then they will be formally excluded. But still a lot of work has to be done. I'm going to do some work on this for a later period, for the 1930s, because I discovered some nice archives that gives me more voices to include, because sometimes it's difficult to find sources to see how formally they work. You see them, sometimes in some committees, but you don't really have a whole story of how they participate in the more formal aspects of politics, even though we do know we have extensive research on them as publicists and journalists and so forth. Yes, thank you.
Neil Millman, geographer. I'm in process of learning the history of South America. I know it's a lifelong process, but I'm more familiar with the northern countries of South America, Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador. And so maybe as a precedent to what happened further south with Simón Bolívar, which you haven't mentioned, he's kind of referred to as the George Washington of South America, and he helped to form the first independence from Spain. how does he figure in as a role model or whatever? Do the northern countries, Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, did they have a better precedent for democracy? Was it a failed experiment, or what would this, kind of the influence that these countries had on their southern neighbors?
Right. Yeah, thank you for the question. It's very important. I did not include him here because what I'm focusing is on the later period. And Simon Bolivar is one of these characters in history that he changed his mind so many times. And so you can have a Bolivar for anything, and it's still being used for absolutely anything. And so it's difficult to see which Bolivar we are referring to. Uh, so I wouldn't see a direct link between Bolivar, particularly in his later stage, where he was more acceptive about the possibilities of republican building, even in South America. He started very enthusiastically, and then sort of that enthusiasm failed, particularly when we see him focusing on the Constitution of Bolivia. And so there he has more of a monarchical authoritarian proposition for the country. So that is why he's so difficult to place, and why so many people tear Bolivar apart, for their own purposes. What you can say is that this, Eduardo Posada Carbó, the editor of the Reimagining Democracy, he's an expert on Colombia. He's been working on this topic in Colombia. And you can see there sort of quite innovations, both in the usage of the term, but also in the implications of using it in relation to universal male suffrage. Although in the case of Colombia, then they will after they adopted in the 1850s, they will trace back and just include some restrictions. So you could see some of that innovation there, but I'm not sure I will link it to Bolivar myself. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ada Eber. I'm a philosophy major. I took a class last semester about gender and history in Latin America, and we talked a lot about how the Catholic Church and government was tied together pretty closely. Do you know anything about like how the Catholic Church responded to these uses of democracy in like government and things?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and you're right that I didn't mention the Catholic Church, and in the chapter I explicitly say that is coming in this book that I'm not including the Catholic Church, mostly because the influence of the Church is so different in different places, and so it's very robust in the case of Peru. Not in the sense of Catholics versus non-Catholics, but it's more about the old Catholic, but it's about the power of the church in politics, what that's disputing about. And so the most conservative, extreme conservative views in Peru came from a bishop, the one who wanted to strip indigenous groups from democracy and was more enthusiastic about the idea of the ruling of the more capable and really restricting the electoral base. So you could see that sort of that division there. In the case of Chile, you don't see so much. The Chilean elite sort of share quite a good understanding of shared politics. It's not going to be until the end of the century where the church is going to become more of an issue. But for this period, the liberals in terms of what they think good government is, the end of the influence of the executive or the politics, a better distribution of power between the executive and the legislature. So those are the issues they're discussing at this time, but not the issues of the role of the church. That is becoming a little bit later in the Chilean history. Yes.
Hi, my name's Grace Chipman, and I'm a history major here. My question was, I wasn't super familiar with, I guess, like the strong democratic history there was in South America before this. So my question was, do you find like the historiography on South American democracy has been very Eurocentric, not focusing on this, or has it just kind of been like people haven't really been studying it yet?
Thank you, Racy. That's a great question. I think for a long time, all history has been quite Eurocentric or North Atlantic centric. So, but particularly, I would say that for the history of democracy. And I think this effort by Hilda Sabato of publishing, getting together these, 30 years of historiography on political practices, and putting in a book in English, because most of that work has been done in the region by historians from the region. Then putting it together in a book in English, which is very accessible, it's a thin book, and call it The Republics of the New World, is an attempt to bring the region into that wider history. So, so in many ways, I think something similar has been happening with democracy, that we used to think that democracy was one thing, that it took place in some places and not in others. And the new approach by Joanna Innes and Mark Philp and Eduardo Posada Carbó of thinking about democracy as a term that evolves, that is used in different moments and so forth, what it does is helps to bring the history of democracy also into a more, into a wider, even more global scenario. With its peculiarities, because it's a peculiar democracy, what it's that building, and there are different societies. So, so I think hopefully, even though there has been some attempts of trying to decentralize the concept of democracy or the history of democracy, hopefully works coming from the a better understanding of democracy in the region will help to bring it together into the wider discussions at a more global stage. So I think it's both some Eurocentric views from North America or the Northern Atlantic, but also the lack of research to try to integrate those into our experiences, into wider experiences on the topic. Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that discussion. Please join me one more time in thanking